Ashes and Amber. Chapter 1. The Quiet After the Sirens. The sound of sirens had been part of Frank Mallory's life for so long that their absence felt unnatural. Now, in the quiet of his small clapboard house in Milford, Virginia, he could hear the creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the rustle of leaves outside. Retired 6 months from the Milford Fire Department, Frank was still adjusting to the stillness, a stillness that sometimes felt like a friend, sometimes like an unwelcome stranger. He sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling between his calloused hands. His eyes kept drifting to the framed photograph hanging above the counter, the old Engine 4 crew, taken on the day they'd been honored for saving a family from a burning duplex. Everyone in that picture had been younger, leaner, grinning like men who thought they had all the time in the world. Frank was 58 now, and though his back was still strong, the years of carrying hoses, climbing ladders, and hauling people from smoke-filled rooms had carved deep lines in his face. His doctor had called retirement a necessary choice, pointing out the blood pressure readings, the old knee injury, the scar tissue in his lungs. Frank had resisted. The firehouse was as much a part of him as his own skin. But the truth was, he knew it was time. His daughter, Emily, had been relieved. She'd driven down from Richmond for the retirement ceremony, hugging him fiercely in the parking lot before saying, "Dad, now you can finally take care of yourself." That had been 6 months ago. Now she called on Sundays, her voice always bright, but Frank suspected she worried about him. She wasn't wrong to. This morning was like most others. A slow breakfast, a few pages from the newspaper, then a walk through the sleepy streets of Milford. The August heat was already building, turning the air syrupy and thick. As Frank passed by the old feed store, closed for nearly a decade, but still standing like an old soldier, he thought about how much the town had changed. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was him who had. The town's main street was lined with hanging baskets of petunias and American flags that had faded a little under the sun. Mrs. Kelly's bakery still opened at 7 a.m. sharp, releasing the smell of cinnamon rolls into the air. Across the street, the hardware store's front door was propped open, a fan humming inside. Frank nodded to a few people he knew, exchanging the usual pleasantries. Yet beneath the small talk was a kind of emptiness, the absence of that adrenaline-fueled purpose that had once driven his days. He was beginning to realize that retirement wasn't about rest. It was about finding a new way to matter. Halfway through his walk, he turned toward the river, where the Milford Bridge arched over slow-moving water. This had always been his thinking spot. He leaned on the railing, watching a pair of herons glide over the surface. The air smelled faintly of rain, even though the sky was mostly clear. That's when he heard it, faint at first, then sharper, a woman's voice calling for help. Frank's body reacted before his mind caught up. His heart thudded, muscles tensing, instincts from decades of service flaring back to life. He scanned the riverbank and saw a figure in a wide-brimmed hat near the old boat dock, waving frantically. Without hesitation, he broke into a run. Chapter 2. The Woman by the River. Frank's boots pounded the wooden planks of the dock, each step echoing the urgency in his chest. The woman was kneeling at the edge, her hat threatening to blow away in the rising breeze. She looked up at him, eyes wide and panicked. "My grandson," she shouted, pointing toward the water. "He fell in! He can't swim!" Frank didn't waste a breath. He scanned the surface of the river and spotted a small figure flailing just 10 yards from the dock, dark hair plastered to his head. His mouth broke the surface in desperate gasps before another wave lapped over him. He kicked off his sneakers and shrugged out of his shirt in one motion. The water was murky, its coolness a shock against the summer heat as he dove in. Years had passed since his last rescue, but his muscles remembered the rhythm. A long, sure crawl toward the struggling child. "Hang on, kid," he called, though the boy's wild thrashing told him words wouldn't matter much. Closing the distance, he hooked one arm around his chest and kicked hard toward the dock. The boy coughed, choked, and clung to Frank like a lifeline. They reached the ladder where the woman knelt, trembling but steady enough to help lift the boy onto the dock. Frank hauled himself up after them, water dripping from his hair, his chest heaving. The boy was shivering but breathing. Frank crouched beside him, speaking gently. "You're okay now. You're safe." He glanced at the woman. "Call an ambulance, just to be sure." "I already did," she said, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God. Oh, thank you. I don't even know your name." "Frank Mallory," he replied, brushing water from his face. The woman's expression shifted from panic to recognition. "Mallory? The firefighter? I thought you retired." "I did," Frank said, sitting back on his heels. "Guess old habits die hard." Within minutes, the wail of sirens, the same sound that had once been the soundtrack to Frank's life, approached. The paramedics checked the boy, determined he was fine except for mild shock, and left with a few words of praise for Frank. The woman introduced herself as Linda Patterson, a widow who'd moved to Milford last spring to be closer to her daughter's family. The boy, Lucas, was 8 years old and, as Linda admitted with a shaky laugh, a little too curious for his own good. As they stood by the dock, Linda insisted on treating Frank to lunch as a thank you. He hesitated, ready to decline, but there was something in her expression, a mixture of gratitude and insistence, that made him nod. They walked together toward Main Street, Lucas holding Linda's hand tightly. They ended up at Kelly's Bakery, where the smell of warm bread filled the air. Linda ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup for Lucas, and coffee for herself. Frank, still damp around the edges, settled for a turkey sandwich. "You didn't even think twice," Linda said after a sip of coffee. "You just went." "That's what you do," Frank replied. "You hear someone in trouble, you move." She studied him for a moment. "Do you miss it, the work?" He hesitated, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. "Every day," he said finally. "It's not the danger. It's knowing you're needed." Linda nodded slowly. "Well, I think you were needed today." Lucas, now halfway through his soup, looked up and grinned shyly. "Thanks, mister." Frank felt something shift in his chest, not the pounding rush of adrenaline, but a quieter, steadier warmth. It had been a long time since someone had looked at him like that. When they left the bakery, Linda handed him a small slip of paper with her phone number. "In case I can ever return the favor." He tucked it into his pocket, not sure if he'd ever use it, but as he walked home, the paper felt heavier than it should, like the first stone in a foundation he didn't know he was building. Chapter 3. The Call That Wasn't a Call. The next morning, Frank woke earlier than usual. The light was pale and cool, filtering through the thin curtains in his bedroom. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Old habits die hard. He was attuned to the smallest sounds, waiting for something urgent, the ringing of a phone, the blare of an alarm, the thump of boots hitting the firehouse floor. But nothing came, just the distant rumble of a garbage truck and the low murmur of morning birds. Frank swung his legs out of bed and sat for a while, rubbing the scar on his left knee. It still ached when the weather shifted, a reminder of the warehouse fire 12 years ago, the one that nearly ended his career early. He remembered the heat, the cracking timbers, and the way he had carried a man twice his size out the back door just seconds before the roof gave way. Back then, every day had purpose. He didn't have to think about what he was supposed to do next. The tones would drop, and his body would move before his mind had a chance to question. Now, in retirement, each day stretched out in open, unmarked space. A blessing, some would say, but for Frank, it was more like a map with no landmarks. That morning, Frank brewed coffee, then sat at the kitchen table, looking again at the old crew photo. He noticed how close they all stood, the arms around shoulders, the big grins. He hadn't spoken to most of them in months. Some had moved away. Others, well, life had a way of scattering people. Frank's phone buzzed on the counter, startling him. For half a second, he thought it might be the station calling for a favor, an extra set of hands for some community event. Instead, it was a text. Linda Patterson says Lucas says hi and wants to know if you like fishing. Frank found himself smiling. He tapped out a reply. Frank: yeah, though I'm better at catching bad weather than fish. Her response came quickly. He wants to go Saturday morning. We've got an extra rod. Frank hesitated. Weekends had always been for catching up on sleep, fixing things around the house. But now? He typed, count me in. The rest of the week passed in its slow Milford rhythm. He mowed the lawn, fixed a squeaky hinge on the back door, and made a run to the hardware store. At the checkout, he overheard two men talking about the old grain mill by the river. Place is falling apart, one of them said. Kids have been sneaking in. Someone's going to get hurt. Frank's ears pricked up. He knew the building well. 3 stories of weathered brick, the top-floor windows long gone, the inside a skeleton of beams and rusting machinery. They'd had calls there before, back when it was still in marginally better shape. Walking home, the conversation stuck in his head. Even retired, his mind couldn't help cataloging hazards, thinking of what could go wrong. And with kids involved. He made a mental note to swing by and take a look. Saturday dawned with a thin mist hanging over the river. Frank met Linda and Lucas at the small pier. Lucas was already talking a mile a minute about the huge catfish he planned to catch. Frank listened, amused, while Linda poured coffee from a thermos and handed him a steaming cup. You didn't have to bring me coffee, he said. You jumped into a river for my grandson. Coffee's the least I can do. They spent the morning casting lines into the still water. Lucas caught nothing but a clump of weeds, but his laughter made it feel like a victory. Frank didn't catch anything either, except a sense of ease he hadn't felt in a long time. By noon, they were packing up when Frank mentioned the grain mill. It's not safe. I might take a look, see if the place can be secured. Linda frowned. You still think like a firefighter. Well, guess I don't know how to stop, he admitted. She smiled faintly. Maybe that's not a bad thing. That afternoon, Frank drove out to the mill, this time with a flashlight, gloves, and the stubborn sense that if nobody else was going to do something, he would. The air inside was damp and heavy, the brick walls blotched with years of weather. He walked carefully, testing each step, noting where the floor sagged or where jagged metal jutted out. Sunlight poured in through shattered windows, illuminating floating dust motes. The silence was deep enough to hear his own heartbeat. On the second floor, he found a pile of beer cans in one corner and a battered skateboard leaning against a wall. The third floor had a gap in the floorboards big enough to swallow a person. He crouched near it, running his hand over the edge of the rotting wood. One wrong step, and a teenager could be in the hospital, or worse. Frank stood there a long moment, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to become the kind of man who lurked around abandoned buildings like a cranky old watchdog, but then again, maybe Milford needed one. He was halfway back to his truck when a voice called out, "Mr. Mallory?" He turned to see a lanky teenager in a faded baseball cap approaching him. Frank recognized him from the hardware store, one of the part-time clerks. I didn't know anyone was here," he said, shifting awkwardly. I sometimes come up here to skate. It's quiet." "It's dangerous," Frank said, not unkindly. "You fall through the floor, nobody's going to find you until it's too late." The kid's ears went red. "Yeah, I guess." Frank studied him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Ethan." "Well, Ethan, you can help me out. Tell your friends this place isn't worth the risk." Ethan nodded quickly, though Frank suspected it wouldn't stop them. That evening, Linda called. She said, "Lucas told me you were at the mill again. What are you looking for, Frank?" "Not looking for anything," he said, "just making sure no one gets hurt." She was quiet for a moment. "You can't save everyone." Frank almost said, "I know," but the truth was, he didn't know how to stop trying. 2 days later, while walking to the diner for lunch, Frank passed by the notice board outside Town Hall. A flyer caught his eye. "Community meeting, discussing the future of the grain mill." It was scheduled for Thursday evening. He stood there for a while, reading the small print. Most people would see it as a dull civic meeting, but for Frank, it felt like a call to action, the closest thing to an alarm bell he'd heard in months. Thursday evening, the meeting room was packed. Frank spotted Linda and Lucas in the back and gave them a nod before taking a seat up front. The mayor droned on about budget constraints and historical value, while a developer proposed turning the site into upscale apartments. Frank's patience wore thin. When they opened the floor for public comment, he stood. "The mill is a hazard," he said, voice steady but firm. "It's not just an eyesore, it's a trap. You want to build something there? Fine. But until you do, seal it off. Don't wait until you're cutting a ribbon at a kid's funeral." The room went quiet. The mayor scribbled something in his notes. Frank could feel every eye on him, some approving, some not, but he didn't care. When the meeting ended, Linda caught up with him outside. "You sounded like the man I met by the river," she said. "Same man, just trying to matter." Linda smiled faintly. "Maybe you already do." That night, Frank lay awake listening to the crickets outside his window. He didn't know it yet, but the mill was about to pull him into something more personal and more dangerous than he'd faced in years. Chapter 4. The Search for the Daughter. With the discovery of Samuel Harris's possible daughter, Walter and Eleanor's mission took on a new dimension. The song, "The Forgotten Melody," was no longer just a piece of music. It was a connection to a family's lost history. They began their search by visiting the local library and combing through old birth records. After hours of searching, they found a single entry: Harris, Samuel, and Margaret, daughter, Elizabeth, born March 15, 1974. "Elizabeth Harris," Eleanor said, staring at the record. "If she's still alive, she'd be in her late 40s now." Walter nodded. "But where would she be, and why is there no trace of her after the accident?" Their next stop was the Maplewood Historical Society. There they met with an elderly volunteer named Marge, who had lived in the town her entire life. "Samuel Harris?" Marge repeated thoughtfully. "I remember him. He was a quiet man, always working on his music. After the accident, the baby was taken in by relatives out of state. I think it was Margaret's sister." "Do you know which state?" Eleanor asked. Marge shook her head. "I'm afraid not, but I do remember someone saying it was somewhere up north. Maine, maybe." Armed with this new information, Walter and Eleanor returned to the record store and began searching online for Elizabeth Harris in Maine. They scrolled through dozens of names, but none seemed to match. What if she changed her name? Eleanor wondered aloud. Maybe she was adopted. It was a possibility they hadn't considered. Without a last name or any other details, their search hit a dead end. A few days later, as Walter was organizing a shipment of records, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see a woman in her late 40s standing in the doorway. She had dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Welcome to Harmony Records," Walter said, walking over. "Can I help you find something?" The woman hesitated, then spoke. "My name's Elizabeth. I heard you're looking for me." Walter's heart skipped a beat. "Elizabeth Harris?" She nodded. "A friend of mine in Maine told me someone was asking about me. I thought I'd come see what this was all about." For a moment, Walter was speechless. Then he called out to Eleanor, who was in the back room. "Eleanor, she's here!" Eleanor rushed out, her eyes widening as she saw Elizabeth. "You're Samuel Harris's daughter," she said, her voice filled with awe. Elizabeth looked surprised. "How do you know my father? He died when I was just a baby." Walter motioned for her to sit down. "It's a long story," he said. As they sat in the back room, Walter and Eleanor told Elizabeth everything. How Eleanor had heard the forgotten melody on a road trip with her late husband, how they had tracked down the tape, and how they had learned about her existence. When they played the song for her, Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "My father, he made this?" Walter nodded. "And now it's yours." Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "I never knew much about him," she admitted. "My aunt raised me, and she didn't like talking about the past. All I have is this." She reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young couple, Samuel and Margaret Harris, holding a baby. "That's you," Walter said softly. Elizabeth smiled through her tears. "It is. And now, thanks to you, I have a piece of him I never knew existed." As the days passed, Elizabeth became a regular visitor at Harmony Records. Together, she, Walter, and Eleanor worked on digitizing and releasing The Forgotten Melody. They decided to dedicate the release to Samuel and Margaret Harris as a tribute to their legacy. But as they prepared the final details, Walter couldn't shake a lingering thought. He pulled Eleanor aside one evening. "Do you think this is what Samuel would have wanted, his music shared with the world?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "I think he would have wanted his family to be remembered. And this song, it's a part of him." Walter nodded, reassured. Chapter 5. The Legacy Lives On. The release of The Forgotten Melody was nothing short of a phenomenon. The haunting piano piece struck a chord with listeners worldwide, capturing hearts and sparking conversations about lost art and untold stories. Music critics praised Samuel Harris's genius, calling the song a masterpiece of raw emotion. For Walter, Eleanor, and Elizabeth, the response was overwhelming but deeply rewarding. They had not only uncovered a lost gem, but also reconnected Elizabeth with her father's legacy. A few weeks after the release, the three of them gathered at Harmony Records for a small celebration. Elizabeth brought a framed copy of the photograph of her parents, which she intended to hang in the store. "This feels like the perfect place for it," she said, holding the photo up to the wall. "It's where the everything started." Walter smiled. "It's where the melody found its way back to us." As they toasted with sparkling cider, Eleanor turned to Elizabeth. "Have you thought about what's next? For you, I mean?" Elizabeth sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about my father's music. I never knew he was a musician, but now I feel like I want to honor his work in some way." "Like how?" Walter asked. "I've been learning to play the piano. It's a little late to start, I know, but I want to connect with my father through his craft." "It's never too late," Eleanor said warmly, "and you've already got his talent in your blood." Walter nodded in agreement. "Maybe one day you'll create your own melody." Elizabeth smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Maybe I will." In the months that followed, Elizabeth's piano skills improved steadily. She began composing her own music, drawing inspiration from her father's work. Meanwhile, Walter and Eleanor continued to run Harmony Records, which had become a hub for music lovers and storytellers alike. One evening, as Walter was closing up the store, Eleanor walked in with a small box. "What's this?" Walter asked, curious. Eleanor handed it to him. "Open it." Inside was a vinyl record. The label read, "Elizabeth Harris, New Beginnings." Walter's eyes widened. "She finished it." Eleanor nodded. "She wanted you to be the first to hear it." Walter carefully placed the record on the player, and the soft, melodic strains of Elizabeth's music filled the room. It was a blend of her father's haunting style and her own unique voice, a testament to the bond they shared even across time. "She's amazing," Walter said, his voice filled with awe. Eleanor smiled. "Just like her father." As the year drew to a close, the three of them stood outside Harmony Records, watching the snow fall gently on Main Street. The store's lights twinkled in the evening darkness, a beacon of warmth and nostalgia. "I can't believe how far we've come," Elizabeth said, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's been quite a journey," Walter agreed. Eleanor looked at them both, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And it's not over yet. There are still so many stories to uncover, so many melodies to find." Walter nodded, his gaze lingering on the store's faded sign. "The music never really ends, does it?" "No," Elizabeth said softly. "It lives on, through us." Epilogue. Years later, Harmony Records remains a beloved fixture in Maplewood. Walter, now in his 70s, continues to run the store with the help of Elizabeth, who has become his partner in preserving the past. Eleanor, though retired, visits often, always bringing new ideas and stories. Together, they've turned Harmony Records into more than just a record store. It's a living archive of memories, a place where lost melodies are found and new ones are born. And sometimes, when the store is quiet and the air is still, Walter swears he can hear the faint notes of The Forgotten Melody, a gentle reminder that the past is always with us, waiting to be rediscovered. The end.